This idea will sound outrageous to anyone raised on a single sanitized version of sacred lore. But imagine for a moment that the Bible, old manuscripts and archaeological data, conceal one of history's deepest spiritual revelations, a prescribed secret deemed far too perilous to reveal openly. I refer to the ebony deities, immensely potent entities honored across millennia, who once held sway before the ascendancy of Yahweh as the exclusive divine name. Across continents went from African plains to Mesopotamian riverlands, from Nile civilizations to the Indus Basin. Ancient peoples left records of dark-skinned divinities tied to creation, wisdom, judgment, and command over Earth's forces. So why were those once venerated figures gradually redacted from texts, recast as demonic or erased by prevailing religious narratives? What follows in this video is not idle conspiracy. It is an unveiling grounded in sidelined manuscripts, nonconformist archaeology, and ancestral spiritual knowledge. Prepare to dismantle certainties you may have accepted as absolute. The sacred image of black divinity, the gods of African nations, and the chronicle of forgotten deities were buried beneath waves of spiritual and political colonization. Yet traces remain, faint vibrations in neglected scriptures, cryptic temple inscriptions, and practices preserved by spiritual lineages worldwide. If you assume Yahweh was humanity's original and sole god, you likely have never encountered the Egyptian Netu, the African Orishas, Sumerian divinities, or even the plural Elohim referenced in the Hebrew texts. The uncomfortable question many avoid is this: why were so many testimonies about black gods deliberately excised, censored, or reinterpreted? What threat did they pose? The removal of these deities was not accidental history. It functioned as a deliberate project of spiritual and political domination, enacted by empires, institutional religions, and their allied power structures, replacing whole pantheons of ancestral, dark-hued gods with a single, masculinized, often whitened deity, stands as one of the most profound spiritual manipulations recorded in human memory. Now, however, that buried story is resurfacing. You are invited on a deep investigation that will assemble the scattered pieces of this vast puzzle. We will examine apocryphal writings that mention such beings, decode the role attributed to fallen angels, trace the origins of the children of God in Genesis 6, and confront narratives suppressed over centuries. This presentation transcends mere theology. It aims at spiritual awakening, ancestral reconnection, and emancipation from colonial modes of belief. In the coming minutes, you will learn why this knowledge was labeled too dangerous to count, why the figure of the black god had to be obliterated, and what unfolds when that sacred recollection is restored. Consider this. What happens to a people who lose the face of their own deity? Almost everything shifts: identity, devotion, destiny. Stay with us. The next disclosures may unsettle you more than anything you've heard before. Before we proceed with the revelations, I want to hear from you. Comment below. Have you come across stories of black gods? Do you think spiritual truths have been hidden from humanity? Your voice matters. To spark discussion and to tell the algorithm this content should reach other awake viewers. If this video has opened a new viewpoint for you, smash the like button. It truly helps spread this message. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next installment, where the forbidden truth will be explored even further. Every thumbs up, every reply, and every new subscriber strengthens this searching community that refuses to accept the story it has always been fed. We are actively reworking the spiritual chronology of humankind, and you are a participant. Walk this path with us. Now that you realize how deeply concealed this knowledge has been, we must return to the origins. Long before the great monotheistic faiths took shape, and even before Yahweh was asserted as the sole divine name, other sacred beings walked the world. I am not referring to isolated folktales, but to enduring millennial accounts. Robust spiritual traditions that describe cosmic entities portrayed as black deities. Ancestral spirits who governed kingdoms with order, law, and arcane authority. Their saga springs from the oldest soils of Africa, Mesopotamia, and the Nile lands. In many African worldviews, the sacred and the mundane were inseparable. Orishas, or Orexars, were not abstract ideas but living, active powers with distinct characters, roles, myths, and crucially, African visage and dark features. Names like Oxala, Shango, Obatala, Oloran carry faces, noses, hair textures, and lineages. How many such names were later slandered or demonized by systems that refused to understand them or wish them gone? Africa holds immense spiritual depth. It is both humanity's cradle and the birthplace of some of the oldest divine conceptions. The earliest attestations of dark-hued gods are no accident. They survive not only in village memory or oral verse, but etched into papyri. Sculpture, altars, temple reliefs, royal inscriptions, ritual bone caches, and rock art. Veneration of these deities stretches across centuries, predating much of the Hebrew canon. In ancient Kemet, we meet the Neteru, a celestial council of gods treated as real agents who regulated cosmic order, life, death, and natural law. Isis, Osiris, Anubis, Thoth, many depicted with dark complexions, broad features, and textured hair, stood as emblems of power, knowledge, and transcendence. Intriguingly, these Neteru bear striking echoes of the Anunnaki of Mesopotamia, otherworldly lineages described as sky-descended rulers. Sumerian tablets speak of figures with bronze-dark skin, intense eyes, and presences before which kings humbled themselves. These visitors did more than appear. They governed. They transmitted agriculture, mathematics, calendrical systems, astronomy, and monumental architecture, the know-how behind pyramids and ziggurats, knowledge that astonishes modern scholars when found in societies labeled primitive. How else can we explain that distant cultures, Africans, Egyptians, Sumerians, Hindus, Maya, all preserved memories of sky beings with powerful, dark appearances who established laws and taught civilizations? Why do so many traditions tell of gods descending to instruct, rule, and then depart with promises of return? Moreover, when Yahweh emerges in biblical accounts, he confronts rival deities, ordering the destruction of their sanctuaries and the eradication of their names. The answer may even lie inside the scriptures themselves, which at points acknowledge other gods while casting them as competitors. Recall Psalm 82, where Yahweh summons a divine assembly and declares, "You are gods, children of the Most High, yet you shall die like mortals." So who were those gods? Where did they originate, and why did Yahweh oppose them? If Yahweh is the sole true deity, the tension exists inside the story, yet few address it. The Bible conceals hints in names, genealogies, and mistranslated original terms that, if read differently, reveal far more about the plural and contested religious landscape of antiquity. Take the word Elohim as a starting point, the Hebrew term commonly translated as God. Notice this: Elohim is grammatically plural. Yes, plural, a word whose literal sense is the gods. Why has that clear plurality been softened, mistranslated, or quietly overlooked across centuries? Perhaps because admitting a pre-existing divine multiplicity would have undermined entire spiritual, political, and social structures erected around a single authority religion. Yet when we peer back to the origins, the evidence is unmistakable. Dark-hued deities once stood as sovereign creators and cosmic regulators. These figures were not regional curiosities. They appeared across distinct cultures using different names but showing an essential likeness. They were described as superior beings arriving from afar, some traditions say from the heavens, the stars, or other realms, to govern, instruct, and codify human life. They became the first monarchs, the first priesthoods, the earliest lawgivers of the sacred. Their authority shaped societies until an entirely new spiritual order supplanted them. The rise of monotheism, placing Yahweh at the center, marked that shift. But to establish that new paradigm, the old gods had to be erased, their stories branded heresy, their images demonized. The transformation was so forceful that scholars and seekers who probe these topics are often dismissed as heretics, conspiracy theorists, or lunatics. Yet if you are listening now, you may feel a stirring, an intuition that the received narrative was incomplete. Perhaps your spiritual roots link to a far older divine lineage, a hidden memory within you waiting to be awakened. This is not only intellectual inquiry, it is a path to rediscovering who you truly are. Once you grasp where the black gods originated, you begin to see why they were removed. Religious empires feared a people who remembered their ancestral deities. A population that perceives itself as children of gods, spiritual heirs of dark celestial kings, is less likely to submit to systems that enslave body and mind. So this is more than information. It is a summons to awakening. If these words have reached you, you have already felt that energy. Something greater stirs. And what you've heard so far is only the opening. Next time we will descend even deeper into the mystery and demonstrate the visible traces these gods left. In customs, bodies, language, and even in the sky. Before we go on, tell me in the comments, do you believe black gods were the planet's first rulers? There, the forbidden truth begins to appear. If you haven't yet liked or subscribed, do it now so the algorithm helps spread this reclaiming of memory. Let us move forward. This is not mere myth or lost cultures. What we are uncovering here is nothing less than a cosmic spiritual conflict, a clash of stories, celestial authorities, and competing memories. What was once preserved and what was strategically erased. The presence of the black gods was not merely neglected by secular historians. Their existence was suppressed deliberately within the very sacred writings that now underpin billions of faithful. If you've ever asked why entire books were kept out of the biblical corpus, or why whole passages were omitted or rephrased across centuries, you are asking the right question. The reason, as you're about to see, centers on those ancient deities, dark-hued spiritual powers who once held sway over sky and soil. They appear in hidden sources but not framed the way modern doctrine would have us read them. As those truths began to surface, they were sealed away, redacted, hidden, censored. The apocryphal literature, texts judged too risky or irregular for the official canon, is densely packed with references to such beings. Take the Book of Enoch, which enjoyed authority in multiple early communities. It delivers a shocking account. The Watchers, the so-called fallen angels, descend, consort with human women, and are depicted as figures of authority, endowed with knowledge, prestige, and awe-inspiring form. They passed down sacred arts, star lore, arcane craft, celestial techniques, and practices that altered human fate. Why did this frighten the architects of monotheism? Because these entities did not fit the singular God template that would elevate Yahweh alone. They were many, potent, beloved by entire peoples, and therefore had to be recast as corrupt or fallen. For this reason, the Book of Enoch was excluded from most councils and remains marginalized in Western Judeo-Christian circles, though it survives and is revered in Ethiopian tradition, itself tied to deep African spiritual lineages. The Jubilees and other fringe works repeat the pattern, celestial teachers who guided humanity but later become suspect. In many original tongues, these beings are described with the dignity and authority of gods. Their fall often reads less like pure malice and more like a sacrifice for humankind. They opened human eyes to forbidden knowledge. Erasure, then, was not total disappearance, but transformation. Rename, vilify, criminalize the gift, and teach fear as doctrine. By recoding memory, turning gods into demons, gifts into sins, ancestors into outcasts, the old divine figures were pushed off stage. They did not vanish. They were systematically hidden. When these figures surface in accepted scripture, they are presented as Yahweh's adversaries, rivals, idols, or menacing powers. But that only deepens the mystery. If they were mere fabrications, why such sustained effort to eradicate them? The Gnostic codices unearthed at Nag Hammadi in 1945 exposed writings long branded heretical, and within them we meet entities called archons and aeons who govern the material realm and meddle with creation. Some passages even imply that the Old Testament's creator God, Yahweh, is not the ultimate high divinity, but a subordinate force who seized control. Over him stand others, older, more conscious, more righteous, many of whose descriptions echo the dark-hued deities of antiquity. Do you see the scale of the erasure? A systematic spiritual excision in which guardians of ancestral wisdom and the primordial rulers of earth were removed from scripture to make room for a single dominant figure. Yahweh does not appear in isolation. He confronts, orders the toppled altars, smashes idols, and silences rival cults. Meanwhile, the texts that told the alternate story were labeled dangerous, forbidden, or heretical. Yet truth resists permanent burial. With the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi Library, Ethiopian scriptures, and living African oral traditions, many suppressed testimonies are resurfacing. Are you prepared to look again? Consider what you've been taught to fear, because once you admit that the hidden knowledge may liberate rather than threaten, everything shifts. That is precisely why narratives pointing to black divinities were met with violence, censorship, and distortion. It was about control, not merely doctrine. Whoever shapes the image of God shapes the hearts and minds of millions. What if God is black? What if African spiritual systems hold keys to reconnecting humanity with its original purpose? What if the rejected books include solutions that institutional religion cannot or will not provide? Do you feel that stir? The restless flame that both troubles and awakens? That impulse is the echo through centuries. The black gods were not annihilated, only muted. Now their voices return through every seeker who refuses a fractured, manipulated history. Comment below, forbidden books reveal the truth on that phrase spreads the awakening. Tell me, did you already know the Book of Enoch? Do you think these truths were intentionally hidden? Have you ever noticed how many biblical passages mention other gods yet never clarify who they were? Why does Yahweh repeatedly confront entities called gods or Elohim if he is supposed to be supreme? Many scholars and authorities avoid these questions out of fear or convenience. In fact, the Hebrew scriptures contain veiled references to a celestial conflict, a struggle for power and territory between Yahweh and deities who long held sway over peoples and lands. These rivals are sometimes named Elion, a term denoting the Most High. These entities operated as spiritual authorities over entire peoples. Every nation, culture, and civilization maintained its own patron deity, sacred laws, and covenants with those divine guardians. Yahweh, who emerges in a clear way through the Abrahamic tradition, presents himself as the God of Israel, not explicitly as the sole God of all nations from the dawn of time. That fact alone unsettles the story that Yahweh was always the only deity. He appears amid a real territorial and theological contest. This struggle was not merely symbolic. Ancient sources describe layered spiritual realms arranged in hierarchies, an actual divine council of superior beings who deliberated on heavenly matters and presided over distinct domains of creation. One of the most revealing witnesses to this concealed conflict is Psalm 82, one of the Bible's most enigmatic and misread chapters. Psalm 82 stages a startling scene, God standing within the assembly of gods among the divine judges. Then Yahweh rebukes these others for failing justice, favoring the wicked while neglecting the vulnerable, and pronounces their fate. You are gods, children of the Most High. Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals. Pause and reflect. Why would Yahweh address these entities as gods, then threaten them with mortality? What kind of being can be acknowledged as divine and yet warned of imminent downfall? Here the veneer of conventional history cracks. Psalm 82 reads not as mere lyric, but as a record of contest between Yahweh and other celestial powers long regarded as genuine gods. Disturbingly, many researchers note that these very beings correspond to deities worshipped by peoples prior to Yahweh's ascendancy. The Torah itself contains passages implying a divided sacred order. Deuteronomy 32, for instance, says the Most High apportioned the nations and set a god over each, selecting Israel for Yahweh's special care. Plainly, Yahweh was the national god of a particular people. Other nations maintained other rulers. So we must ask, who were those rival governors? Why were they effaced? And why did Yahweh confront them? The motive is evident. A spiritual contest for domination of land and soul. The Elon, the black gods, the Watchers, the Netaru, by whatever names, were woven into the ancestral practices of communities. They conveyed cosmological wisdom, seasonal knowledge, star lore, embodied rituals, and a plural, integrated spirituality. That plurality posed a threat to forces seeking centralized religious authority. To proclaim Yahweh as sole sovereign demanded the dismantling of what came before. Altars toppled, cults suppressed, priests persecuted, and once honored protectors recast as false gods. Some were demonized, others erased, still others recast into villainous roles. But without exception, they embody fragments of spiritual memory the prevailing system sought to wipe away. Notice too that Yahweh, throughout many Old Testament passages, often appears fiercely jealous and demanding of exclusive worship, ordering the destruction of peoples who honored other gods, demanding their names be struck from memory and insisting on singular allegiance. That behavior hardly reads like an always uncontested sovereign. It reads like a power that had to fight for preeminence among already established divinities. This helps explain why prophets repeatedly warned the people against turning back to older cults. They were not inventing new idols but resuming worship of gods who existed long before the monotheistic overhaul that rewrote sacred history. And by now you can see this spiritual struggle is far from ancient history. It continues today, not with swords but through doctrine, censorship, faith manipulation, and control over spiritual imagination. Have you ever sensed that uneasy question others avoid? That a piece is missing from the puzzle of your belief? That sensation is the echo of this conflict, the muted cry of black gods remembered yet suppressed. Spiritual memory resists extinction. It survives in bloodlines, embodied traditions, intuitive knowing, and in the deepest dreams of people. Share in the comments. Have you ever felt something was off about what you were taught about God? Use the phrase hidden spiritual war to keep this dialogue alive and visible. Now we arrive at one of the most sensitive and transformative parts of this inquiry, the part many silence, not because it is false, but because it reveals too much. The suppression of the black gods and the heavenly contest between Yahweh and the Elon did not occur only in scripture or myth. It unfolded in flesh and color, in the identity of whole peoples. Why, for example, does the divine image most of us grew up with rarely resemble the faces around us? Why are Jesus and angels often depicted with light features in Western art? Why do school illustrations render ancient Egyptians and prophets with European traits? These are not accidental mistakes. They are part of a systematic project to erase black spirituality. The erasure began with textual replacement and continued through iconography, changing faces on altars, in catechesis, and public imagery. Yet despite persecution, slavery, diaspora, and colonization, African narratives persist. Preserved memories of dark-hued kings and celestial figures who guided and protected communities for millennia. These beings were not mere monarchs but incarnated divine presences, the Orishas, the Neteru, the ancestral sovereigns, each bearing the seals of black spiritual royalty. In Bantu traditions, for instance, there exists the idea of Nambi, a black creator who is the wellspring of life and acts through ancestral spirits. In Candomblé and Umbanda, the Orishas are depicted with dark bodies, African features, and personalities woven into the rhythms of nature and cosmic forces. They do not dwell only in the heavens, they inhabit bodies, land, seasons, and the vital energies that move us. Yet how often have these systems been mocked, outlawed, or demonized? The reason is the threat they pose. When black people recognize themselves as heirs to divine kings, they rupture the invisible levers of colonial, religious, and psychological domination. They reconnect with a sacred origin and realize they are neither expendable nor inferior, but part of a lineage that predates European empires, slavery, and faith colonization. This claim is not limited to African sources. Forgotten Hebrew traditions preserved among African-descended communities point to Israelite groups of black origin. The peoples who left Egypt were not fair-skinned Europeans. Canaan and its neighbors included Ethiopia, Nubia, and Sudan, and ancient Egypt was very much part of that same cultural spiritual web in which rulership and divinity bore dark skin, curly hair, and African physiognomy. Afro-oriented scholars, often dismissed by mainstream institutions, have collected archaeological, anthropological, and textual evidence suggesting early biblical religiosity carried Afro-Oriental roots. Yahweh did not arise in a vacuum. Dozens of African deities and complex cosmogonies preceded and shaped the religious landscape, where blackness was a marker of the divine and the eternal. What happens to a black child raised with no sacred image that resembles them? When every holy face in art is pale and straight-haired, the collective unconscious fractures. Self-worth is eroded, identity splinters, and ancestral ties are stolen. That is the real spiritual theft of history. Sever the image of the sacred black body and you rob a people of their divine heritage. Yet reclamation is underway. Thousands worldwide are rediscovering that African spiritualities are not primitive or marginal, but living memories of sacred ancestors. When a black person meets their reflection and recognizes the same skin carried by erased gods, they begin to understand why suppression was so violent. A people who see themselves as made in God's image will not easily accept subjugation. Perhaps now you better see why Christ's portrait was reshaped, why his Middle Eastern, desert-born life among darker peoples was repainted into European features. If the Savior's image is black, long-standing dogmas shake and structures built to keep people oppressed risk collapse, and the forbidden truth begins to shine again. Do you feel that stir in your chest as you listen? This is more than mere curiosity. It is spiritual memory awakening. Wherever you are, The call of the black gods echoes in conscience, and every recovered text, ritual, and song in the African matrix rekindles a spark that never truly burned out. What you were taught to despise may in truth be the very path that frees you. What was labeled pagan or demonic could be your lost link to divine ancestry. Black spirituality is more than cultural resistance. It is a reclamation of belonging. This is the continuing tale of gods who preceded us, rulers and teachers long erased, now stirring back to life through your searches and voices. Comment below, I am a descendant of kings and gods. If this message moves you, write, I am watching, so I know how far this revelation travels. Let us pick up exactly where we left off, because what follows is one of the most crucial keys to grasping not only humanity's spiritual past, but also the inner battles people still endure. By now you recognize that black spiritual identity was suppressed, warped, and hushed. But an even deeper layer underpins that erasure. The buried story of the rebellion of the so-called anti-gods. A deliberate rewriting that recast masters as monsters, teachers as demons, and guides as celestial foes. Think of Osiris, Enki, Thoth. Names you may have heard only as mythic figures. What if those names belonged to real intelligences who once walked the earth, healed, taught, governed, and in the end were betrayed? Consider the Book of Fallen Angels in the Bible as a later edited echo of far older accounts whose central actors were dark-hued divinities. Osiris was revered as Lord of Regeneration in the cycle of life and death. His violent demise and return formed the core of Egyptian mystery rites. He was not a devil, but a sacrificed sovereign, a judge promised at the world's turning, an archetype that unmistakably shadows later savior figures. Enki of Sumer was a creative patron who descended to aid humanity. He taught crafts, agriculture, law, healing, and secret arts. Far from malevolent, he defended humankind against harsher celestial decrees and chose compassion over distant authority. Does that sound like the rebellious figure other traditions called Lucifer? The parallel is clear. Enki's defiance has been recast across time as transgression rather than mercy. Thoth, the divine scribe, brought writing, counting, calendrical knowledge, and the very frameworks of order, the bridges between worlds. Without such figures, civilizations as we know them would not have taken shape. Yet the images of these powerful, often dark-featured gods were dismantled, turned into quaint myths, ridiculed, or dismissed by dominant theological narratives, even though their marks remain in monuments, ritual, and memory. Pause and ask, how many beings labeled fallen by orthodox tradition were truly those who risked heavenly wrath to hand power and consciousness to humanity? Why were those who brought fire, knowledge, and light branded as the greatest threats? This is not accidental. It is deliberate control, a conscious strategy. The same pattern repeats. Anyone who threatens the established order, who gives power back to the people, who awakens collective consciousness, is systematically erased. That method shows up even in how names and symbols were rewritten. Once honored lights become branded as darkness. The serpent, long a symbol of wisdom across many cultures, was recast as the tempter. The morning star, emblematic of radiance, awakening, and ascent in several traditions, was recast as an enemy. But did the star truly fall, or was it pushed down? These ancient beings did not fall from pride. They descended out of compassion. That distinction must be made plainly. They opposed celestial authoritarianism because they believed humanity deserved autonomy, access to sacred knowledge, and a direct relationship with the divine, which threatened those who preferred humans servile and dependent. Thus their rebellion was rewritten as sin, rather than a sacrificial act for human liberation. When Genesis speaks of the Watchers who came down and consorted with human women, the received tale paints them as corruptors and outcasts. What is rarely told is that these figures taught agriculture, craft, astronomy, and law. They were branded fallen because they came down, forbidden because they revealed, enemies because they set people free. Here is the profound truth. Their descent was not a fall in the pejorative sense, it was a giving down. They sacrificed their exaltation so humanity might rise. But when the victors retold the story, everything flipped. Light became darkness, liberators became curses, and the masses remained blind, unaware that the fire warming their souls had been brought by those labeled enemies of heaven. Now you may see that the very notion of the fall deserves re-examination. Not every being who descended from the heavens acted maliciously. Perhaps the truly fallen are those who punished compassion, and the true adversaries are those who warped the narrative to preserve absolute control over belief and destiny. If this message moves you, comment below. The gods fell for us. Those words carry weight. Let us continue from this point, because next we will examine the disruptive implications this suppressed truth has for everything we call faith, religion, and spirituality. If these themes are stirring something inside you, know that it is not accidental. These disclosures threaten the very pillars of Orthodox theology. They do more than dispute a dominant storyline. They undermine a whole edifice built to keep people disconnected from their sacred origins. Have you noticed how many religious authorities shy away, grow hostile, or even denounce these inquiries as heresy, blasphemy, or demonic? Why such fierce resistance? If faith seeks truth, why forbid questioning? Why bar investigation of ancient texts, African cosmologies, and pre-catechetical spiritualities? The reason is painful but clear. Accepting the reality and significance of the black gods dissolves the long-standing monopoly over religious truth. If pre-Yahwistic divine figures were real, wise, and sacred, then the account of a single god emerging ex nihilo and demanding exclusive worship falters. If the so-called fallen were actually teachers, the enemy may be only the mirror of another divine force that loved humanity against imperial control. If black sovereigns once ruled in wisdom and holiness, why were their temples razed and names struck out? Once you allow that possibility, your image of God shifts, from a distant, pale, punitive overseer to a reflection of ancestry, communal identity, history, and skin. That shift decolonizes belief, restores spiritual dignity, and empowers peoples taught to think of themselves as servants rather than heirs to kings and gods. No wonder established powers fear such a revelation. A true heresy that proves liberating cannot be allowed to spread. Traditional theology built within imperial projects often served to order and control rather than to open. It excluded African voices and justified domination, teaching for centuries that black people lacked soul or civilized faith, rhetoric that clergy and textbooks repeated to erase black divinity and replace it with a Eurocentric sacred image. Now that this buried truth resurfaces, resistance is inevitable because it threatens the unchallenged throne. But this movement is not about swapping oppressions or claiming a superior deity. It is about restoring equilibrium, recognizing spiritual plurality, multiple faces of the sacred, and honoring African peoples as active participants in divine manifestation. Imagine what happens when a generation wakes, seeks original texts, values the African spiritual matrix, and understands that their ancestors were not only enslaved bodies but priests, kings, builders, astronomers, philosophers, and spiritual custodians. Imagine the change that occurs when a whole people begins to see their skin as sacred, when they find themselves mirrored in the faces of gods, in myths, in the heavens. This collective awakening of black spiritual identity terrifies dominant theology because it does not fit tidy doctrines, council rulings, or fixed creeds. It arises from the heart and ancestral memory, from energy stored in bone and blood. It asks no official permission. It demands only to be remembered. And memory is returning. Researchers, artists, spiritual guides, youth leaders, and elders everywhere are digging inward and finding the divine spark that was stolen. This reconnection mostly happens beyond cathedrals and institutions, in circle talks, ritual dances, private study groups, dreams, and unbidden visions. You might feel fear. That's natural because you were taught that questioning orthodoxy is sin and that seeking other truths is rebellion. But which is the true heresy? Searching sincerely for truth, or using the name of God to deny a people's spiritual identity for centuries? You have both the right and the sacred duty to search for missing pieces in your spiritual puzzle. This quest is not rebellion but healing, a return to wholeness. If this call resonates, you are not alone. You belong to a generation reshaping humanity's spiritual history. Comment below. Heresy is the key to hidden truth, and tell us how this message shifts your image of God and your ancestry. Now we cross the border between symbol and matter. The most unsettling evidence awaits. Physical traces of black gods are not only in texts and oral memory but in stone, papyrus, temple carvings, buried and displayed, visible to those brave enough to look. More striking, many of these traces sit in museums, universities, and collections worldwide. yet often cannot be seen through the lens of awakened consciousness. Visit a major Egyptian exhibit in London, Paris, New York, or Berlin, and you will observe statues of pharaohs, gods, scribes, and guardians with plainly African features. Dark skin tones rendered in resin or pigment, broad noses, full lips, braided hair, details rarely addressed. Guides stay silent, labels omit commentary, and exhibition catalogs frequently ignore what is obvious. Admitting that the divine figures who shaped some of history's most influential civilizations were black changes everything. Black iconography among the gods is one of the strongest, most enduring acts of resistance against spiritual erasure. It survived epochs, conquest, forced Christianization, and the European remaking of sacred imagery. Even after centuries of vandalism, many gods, Osiris, Isis, Anubis, Thoth, Horus, remain depicted with deep dark skin, wearing regalia that signals African ancestral authority, posing with the dignity of wisdom, rulership, and transcendence. Yet few mainstream theologians, academic historians, or official documentaries will state this plainly. These black deities are not limited to Egypt. Across Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, we find iconography with parallel features. Intense eyes, dark tones, commanding presences carved in cylinder seals, clay tablets, and cuneiform inscriptions. The evidence is visible. A recurring emblem is the winged solar disk, a mark of divinity that frequently crowns figures who descend from the heavens. These human-like yet ceremonial beings are commonly portrayed with robust, dark features and crowned heads. Egyptian papyri, especially Book of the Dead scenes, show dark-hued divinities presiding over judgments of souls. This is literal, not merely symbolic. Dark pigmentation in these works announced power, origin, and sacred identity. Modern publications and reprints, however, often mute or alter those visual facts. Why? Here institutional silence plays its role. Museums and universities know what their collections contain. Iconographic scholarship demonstrates that early sacred systems were formed by dark-skinned peoples tied to the earth, seasonal cycles, and cosmic energies. Yet such realities are presented with a studied neutrality that avoids naming color, face, or origin, because to do so would acknowledge what centuries of denial sought to erase. If humanity's original spirituality was black, then the structures built atop that erasure must be re-examined. Eurocentric dogmas lose their assumed legitimacy. More importantly, black people begin to see that they need no external intermediaries or foreign validation to reclaim their sacred link. It is written in stone, inscribed in tombs, and preserved in surviving rites. Still, despite the clarity of the record, attempts persist to reinterpret the past through a Western lens. Broken statues, deliberately defaced faces, smashed noses, physical erasure that mirrors spiritual deletion. This is not accident but pattern. If divinity bears a black face, the old system's grip on control is threatened. When a people finally recognizes its reflection in the eternal, fear dissolves and spiritual servitude ends. Do not be mistaken. Archaeology is not neutral, scholarship is not neutral, and institutional silence is itself a method of domination. If experts do not speak plainly, it is not because proof is lacking, but because the evidence is overwhelming. It shouts, exposes, and threatens long-held systems. The divine first manifested in black skin and continues to do so. That reality is re-entering collective awareness and must circulate freely. By listening now, you are taking part in that recovery. You are being called to look with new eyes, to loosen the grip of a single sanctioned truth, and to excavate not only tombs and ruins, but the ancestral memory lodged inside your bones. If this message opens something in you, write in the comments. The truth is in stones and faces, and tell us whether you've seen these images in museums, books, or dreams. Let us pick up where we left off. We have reached one of the most tender and profound moments of this journey. Hearing is not enough. Knowing is not enough. This knowledge must move beyond intellect into soul and produce real transformation. So now pause and ask yourself, what changes in your faith when you take this in? Stop. Inhale slowly. Close your eyes if you wish. Call to mind the images of God you learned as a child, the sermons, the dogmas repeated without fully understanding, the obedience taught through fear. Hold all that beside what you have just discovered. Perhaps the divine you were told lived distant and unreachable has always been woven into your lineage, your skin, your story. Imagine the cold, colorless altar, no rhythm, No herbs, no drumbeat, no dance, no embodied presence. And consider that it could never have contained the whole of God. Black spirituality is embodied, sound, rhythm, movement. It does not divide matter from spirit. It reunites them. She does not condemn the body. She honors it. She does not urge you to flee the world. She teaches you to remake the world with your sacred energy. Everything long labeled mundane or sinful can become the path back to your divine source. Ask yourself, how can you keep seeing God the same way after learning that the divine was pictured as black, as royal ancestors, as sacred women, as beings who loved you before your birth? How can anyone continue to treat your people as inferior when stones, papyri, and living traditions show that your forebears first spoke with the heavens, built temples healed by touch, read the stars, and invoked the gods with burning hearts? In that realization, ancient walls begin to crumble. Walls raised by centuries of imposed theology, forced catechesis and doctrines that replaced power with guilt, wisdom with sin, and sovereignty with submission. You face a rare chance to be made whole again, not by a faith that shames or erases you, but by a living, deep black spirituality that beats in drum sound, shimmers in an elder's gaze, moves in dance, and visits in night dreams when the old gods still speak to those who listen. Do you feel its force? Can you see how your spiritual life transforms when you know your origin is not a history of only bondage, but of divinity? That you are not a penitent seeking a distant lord, but a descendant of gods who once walked this soil? This is more than information. It is soul medicine, spirit restoration, recovery of an identity long told not to exist. Now is not merely the hour to observe, but to answer the call. Begin repairing your spiritual ties, relight ancestral rites, relearn embodied prayer, hands on earth, eyes to the sky, rhythm in the chest. Understand that what truly estranged you from God may not be the world or the flesh, but the shame imposed by powers determined to hide your sacredness. You need not abandon everything you were taught. You need not destroy one faith to embrace fuller vision. Expand the frame. God exceeds any single doctrine, book, wall, or face. God can manifest in many forms, and yes, one of those may share your skin, hair, and features. This is not heresy, but the recovery of sacred memory. Small steps begin the return. Honor your ancestors. Light a candle, sit in silence and listen. Read the hidden texts. Allow the sacred fire to rise in your chest. Not as terror of punishment, but as longing for the sky within you. When you remember who you are spiritually, you do not become someone new. You become the person you always were. Expect doubts, fear, and confusion. Healing often feels like rupture at first. But this is part of the path. Every act of spiritual liberation first appears as heresy. Then comes the relief, a lightness, a deep exhale, the sense of finally being whole again. From that moment, everything shifts: the way you pray, the face you meet in the mirror, the way you stand in the world. So answer me honestly. What changes in your faith now that you know this? Write it in the comments. Share this instant with me. A single word or a whole paragraph will do. Type also, "I am returning to my spiritual roots." That phrase is no mere comment. It is a pledge, a doorway, a promise. Let us continue right where we left off, because now more than ever you must turn inward to the heart, to the spiritual center that may have slumbered or waited its hour to wake. What we have revealed so far serves a larger purpose than information or astonishment. It wakes a deep layer of consciousness that challenges, heals, rebuilds, and reconnects. So pause and ask the question that can change the course of your soul from this moment onward. What changes in your faith knowing this? The question is simple, but functions like a master key opening hidden chambers of the spirit. When those doors open, you gain not only new facts, but a new sight of who you are, where you came from, and where you are headed. If all we've shown is true, if stories, ruins, rites, manuscripts, and living traditions point to the same lineage, then faith cannot be mere repetition of handed-down formulas. Your faith must become reunion with your deepest root. Maybe you were raised to believe in a distant, unreachable God who must be placated to avoid punishment. Perhaps you learned that the sacred sat on a throne beyond reach, and you were only a servant trying to earn a glance. Now, in the light of what you've discovered, you begin to sense that those gods have always been nearer than you were told. In the faces of your ancestors, in the drum your grandmother danced to, in the whispered prayers at dawn, in the scent of burned herbs, in the movement your body remembers even when doctrine tried to erase it. So what changes when you know the gods who walked the earth shared your skin, your language, your songs, your energy? Everything changes. Your spiritual posture shifts. The way you pray transforms. The altar of your heart rearranges. You no longer seek approval from a remote throne. You seek reconnection from within. That reconnection begins with the memory lodged in every cell, in every feature, in every long breath. Faith no longer needs to be fearful. It can be light, jubilant, danced, sung, lived by the whole body. Ancestral spirituality did not cleave spirit from flesh, heaven from earth, divine from human. It joined them. She wove everything into a single sacred web. Food became ritual, touch became temple, and everyday acts turned into portals. This reconnection is available to you now. Stop looking only outward and begin listening to the faint voices inside. A warmth in the chest, an urge to weep or laugh. A sense of I always knew but lacked the words. That is your root calling. The spirit remembering it was never orphaned, only taught to forget. Now that you know, you can choose remembrance. This does not demand abandoning what you already hold spiritually. It invites expansion, inclusion, and deepening. God is not owned by one culture, book, or creed. The creative source shows up in countless faces and voices, among them the silenced voices of black gods. When you hear them again, in an intuition, a dream, a shiver, a sudden tear, you align with your original lineage and come home. As you return, old paradigms fall. The notion of being born cursed loses sway, inherited guilt weakens, and rituals of obligation that no longer serve begin to dissolve. Your faith no longer rests on fear but on truth. Your origin is sacred, your destiny is sovereignty. What changes in your spiritual life is the center. You move from the margins to the temple that is yourself. The divine does not condemn your skin, your dance, or your music. It dwells in them. You can now relate to that presence deeply and without shame. You may honor the ancient gods who walked these lands before Yahweh. Learn from them. Hear their teachings in every drumbeat, sacred plant and star. In doing so, you are not betraying faith. You are reclaiming it, restoring a broken link and healing a wound passed down through generations. If this stirs you, leans you, or unsettles you, know that the movement of remembrance has begun. You've already begun the return. Memory is waking now. Quietly, perhaps without you noticing, the inner altar is being rebuilt. That altar does not demand marble or gold. It only needs your presence, the honesty of ancestry, the courage to break with what kept you small, and the humility to accept the greatness that has always been yours. So write in the comments, "My faith is coming home." This is more than a line. It is a spiritual declaration cast out into the universe. Tell me also, what moved you most in this journey? What flickered awake inside you? I want to read your answers, to feel this rising with you. If you haven't liked the video yet, now is the moment. A like helps this message reach other searching souls. If you remained here until the end, leave a comment. I honor my ancestors and my spirituality. I want to see who walked this path with me and is ready to continue. Subscribe if you haven't. We are only at the opening of many recoveries, revelations, and reconnections to come. Don't stop here. Click the next video appearing on your screen. It continues this conversation and deepens what we've awakened together. See you there.